For almost all of human history, a heat wave was simply weather. It was an act of nature, or of the gods, something that happened to people, with no cause anyone could name, and no one to hold responsible. You endured it, you prayed for rain, and you called it a bad summer. That is no longer true. And it is the single most important way this heat wave, and every heat wave of our era, is different from every one that came before it. Because now, within days of a major heat wave, scientists can run the numbers and tell you something no generation before us could ever have known: how much of it we caused. Earlier this year, when a brutal heat wave scorched the American Southwest, a team of researchers reached a conclusion in a matter of days: that the temperatures being experienced would have been, in their words, virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Not worse than it would have been, not a little hotter. Virtually impossible. A heat wave that simply could not have happened in the world as it existed before we changed it. This is the story of how the heat wave itself has changed, not just how hot it gets, but what kind of thing it has become, and of the genuinely new knowledge that lets us say, for the first time in history, that a heat wave is no longer just an act of nature. It is, in part, an act of us. Let me be precise about what I mean, because precision matters. When I say this heat wave is different from everyone before it, I am not claiming that this specific week, in late July of 2026, is the single hottest stretch in all of history. It isn't. In fact, the most extreme temperature records of this very summer fell a few weeks ago, not this week, and as this heat dome bakes the middle of the country, both coasts are actually fairly mild. So this is not a video about one freakish week. It is about something deeper and more unsettling. The entire nature of heat waves has shifted. The heat waves of our time are a fundamentally different kind of event than the ones your grandparents lived through. Measurably hotter, longer, and larger, striking in new places, and for the first time ever, provably shaped by human hands. Let me show you what changed, and how we know. Start with the changes you can measure with nothing more than a thermometer and a calendar, because they are real and they have all moved in the same direction at once. Today's heat waves are hotter. All-time temperature records, the hottest a place has ever been in its entire history, are falling across the world, this summer alone. An American city that had kept records since the 1870s saw its hottest day in 152 years. They are more frequent. As the Director General of the World Health Organization recently put it, the once-in-a-generation heat wave is now arriving nearly every year. They are longer, driven by stubborn high-pressure patterns that can lock brutal heat in place for a week or two at a stretch instead of an afternoon. They are larger, sprawling across enormous areas at once. The heat dome sitting over America right now stretches from Texas all the way up into Canada. Their nights are hotter, refusing to cool down after dark, which removes the nightly recovery the human body depends on and is a huge part of why modern heat waves kill. And their season is longer, with dangerous heat now arriving as early as spring and lingering deep into fall. To make that concrete, imagine setting a severe heat wave from the past, say one of the brutal Dust Bowl summers of the 1930s, beside a severe heat wave of today. On the surface, they might post similar peak temperatures on a given afternoon, and someone might reasonably ask what the difference really is. But look closer, and they are almost different species of event. The modern one is likely to last longer, holding its grip for a week or more rather than breaking after a few days. It is likely to cover far more ground, baking a dozen states at once instead of a region. Its nights will stay dangerously warm rather than cooling off toward dawn. It is far more likely to be one of several such events in the same summer rather than a singular catastrophe. And it is arriving on top of a climate baseline that is already meaningfully warmer, so it starts from a higher floor. The peak number on the thermometer is the one thing that looks familiar. Almost everything else about the event has changed. Each of those is a real, documented shift. But here is the thing. Those are symptoms. They tell you the heat is worse, but they don't tell you what is genuinely, categorically new about it. And two things are new, truly new, unlike anything in the entire history of heat waves before our lifetimes. The first is that we can now prove where the heat came from. The second is that the heat is no longer alone. Those two ideas are the real heart of this video. Let me take the first one, because it is one of the most remarkable scientific achievements of our time, and most people have no idea it exists. It is called attribution science. For all of human history, you could feel that a heat wave was unusual, but you could never prove why it happened. And you certainly could never assign it a cause. A hot summer was just bad luck. Attribution science shattered that limitation. Here is how it works, and it is genuinely elegant. When an extreme heat event occurs, scientists compare two worlds. The first is the real world, the actual warmed planet we live on, with all the greenhouse gases we've added to the atmosphere. The second is a simulated world, a version of Earth as it would have been without human-caused warming, reconstructed using historical climate records going back over a century and large ensembles of climate models. Then they ask a simple question: how likely and how intense was this heat wave in each of those two worlds? The difference between the answers is the fingerprint of human influence. It is, in effect, a way of measuring how much we loaded the dice. And the truly stunning part is the speed. A group called World Weather Attribution now performs these analyses within days of an event, while the heat wave is still in the headlines, while people are still in the hospitals. They have turned, was this climate change? From a question that used to be argued about for years, or dismissed as unanswerable, into one that can be answered almost in real time. And the answers have been coming back with a consistency that is genuinely sobering. It is worth appreciating just how new this capability is, because it underscores the whole point. Extreme event attribution barely existed a generation ago. The field is usually traced to a single study, published around 2004, that examined the catastrophic European heat wave of 2003, a disaster that killed on the order of tens of thousands of people across the continent. For the first time, scientists put a number on it, estimating that human-caused warming had at least doubled the risk of such an event. That was the birth of an entirely new branch of science, and it happened well within living memory. In the 2 decades since, it has matured astonishingly fast, from a slow, painstaking analysis that took years into the rapid, days-long studies we have now. Which means the ability to look at a heat wave and say who and what caused it is younger than many of the people watching this. A tool so new that your grandparents and even your parents lived their entire lives without it. Every heat wave before about 20 years ago went to its grave with its cause a permanent mystery. Ours do not. Consider just the events of this year and the recent past. That American Southwest heat wave I mentioned, the one deemed virtually impossible without climate change, was found to have been made several degrees hotter by somewhere between roughly 5 and 7 degrees Fahrenheit by human activity. A severe pre-monsoon heat wave across South Asia was found to have had its probability roughly tripled by climate change, exposing hundreds of millions of people to longer and deadlier heat. The ferocious heat wave that struck Europe in June, the one that killed, by an initial World Health Organization accounting, at least 1,300 people across France, Germany, and beyond, was found to have been virtually impossible just 50 years ago. And when scientists zoomed out and systematically analyzed hundreds of heat waves from across the first 2 decades of this century, the findings were almost hard to believe. Warming had made the typical heat wave of the 2000s about 20 times more likely, and the typical heat wave of the 2010s about 200 times more likely than it would have been in a world without human influence. Fully a quarter of those events were essentially impossible without climate change, and the sheer human scope of it, one recent global assessment concluded that around 4 billion people, roughly half of everyone alive, endured at least a month of additional extreme heat days in a single year, purely because of climate change. At this point, the pattern is so consistent that the experts have stopped being surprised by it. As one climate scientist put it, he has not seen a heat wave attribution study in years that did not show a considerable influence of global warming. The default assumption now, he said, simply has to be that human influence is present. Another summed up the whole shift in a single line. What used to be unprecedented events are now recurring features of a warming world. Now let me be fair and careful here, because this deserves honesty rather than hype. Attribution science deals in probabilities and computer models, not in the certainty of a laboratory experiment. You cannot rerun the summer of 2026 on a second Earth without us to check the answer directly. And the scientists who do this work are, to their credit, unusually transparent about that. They publish their confidence levels, and they are candid about which kinds of events they can attribute with high confidence and which they cannot. And it turns out that heat waves are the single category where that confidence is highest, higher than for floods, or tornadoes, or individual storms, for a simple reason: heat is the most direct and straightforward consequence of a warming atmosphere. When you add heat energy to the planet, you get more heat. It is nearly that simple. So when attribution scientists say a heat wave was made dramatically more likely by human warming, they are saying one of the most robust things their entire field is capable of saying. This is not a guess. It is, for the first time in history, genuine knowledge about the origin of the weather. A heat wave used to be an act of nature. Now it is, measurably and provably, partly an act of us. And no one who lived before this generation could ever have known that. And the science has grown so precise that it is beginning to do something that would have sounded like fantasy a generation ago: assign specific, quantified responsibility. One recent study went beyond simply attributing heat waves to humanity in general, and instead traced them to the so-called carbon majors, the roughly 180 largest fossil fuel and cement producers in the world. It concluded that climate change had made more than 200 historical heat waves more likely and more intense, and it apportioned measurable shares of that influence to individual companies. Think about what that means. It is now scientifically possible, at least in principle, to look at a deadly heat wave and estimate how much a particular corporation's emissions contributed to it. And, predictably, this is no longer just an academic exercise. Attribution findings are increasingly showing up in courtrooms and in policy as the basis for lawsuits and regulations that try to hold specific actors accountable for specific climate harms. A heat wave, in other words, has gone from being an unassignable act of God to something that can appear as evidence in a court of law. There is no starker illustration of how completely the nature of a heat wave has changed. That is the first thing that makes our heat waves unlike any before them. Here is the second, and it may be even more important. Our heat waves are no longer alone. For all of history, a heat wave was a local or regional event. One place would bake while the rest of the world carried on as normal. A brutal summer in one country was simply that country's misfortune, and its neighbors and the other side of the planet were fine. That is changing, and changing fast. Increasingly, extreme heat is striking multiple continents at the same time. In the same season, a phenomenon scientists call concurrent or compound heat extremes. And you do not have to look further than this very year to see it. In the spring, a deadly heat wave gripped South Asia. In June, a record-shattering heat wave rolled across Europe, killing well over 1,000 people. And all summer long, heat wave after heat wave has hammered the United States. The planet, in other words, has been running a fever in many places at once. The heat is no longer taking turns. Why does that matter so much? Because the leading scientific voices on this have now shifted their entire focus toward it. A major 2026 assessment from the United States' most authoritative scientific advisory panel concluded that the key question has moved beyond, is this climate change? That much is now considered settled for heat, to a harder and more urgent one: how bad do things get as these extremes increasingly overlap? Their reasoning is stark. As each individual type of climate extreme grows more frequent, the odds of several of them happening simultaneously, or hitting the same place one after another, rise sharply. And simultaneous, overlapping disasters are far more dangerous than the sum of their parts. Think about why. When heat waves strike multiple major agricultural regions of the world at the same time, they can damage several of the planet's breadbaskets at once, threatening global food supplies and sending prices spiking everywhere, not just in the affected countries. This particular risk deserves a moment because it is one of the least visible and most dangerous. The world's food supply quietly depends on the assumption that its major grain-growing regions, the American Midwest, the plains of Russia and Ukraine, the fields of India and China, the farms of Europe, will not all fail in the same year. For most of history, that assumption was safe, because a bad summer in one region was largely independent of the weather everywhere else. But as extreme heat becomes global and simultaneous, that independence erodes. A single hot, dry season that hammers several breadbaskets at once could cause multiple harvests to falter together, and because the world holds only a limited buffer of stored grain. Simultaneous crop failures could translate very quickly into shortages and sharply rising food prices across the entire planet. It is exactly the kind of systemic, interconnected risk that simply did not exist when heat waves stayed local, a way in which a hot summer in several places at once could reach into the grocery cart of someone thousands of miles from any of them. When disasters happen simultaneously, no region has any spare capacity to send help to another because everyone is fighting their own emergency at the same moment. And a single heat wave rarely stays a single problem. The same heat that endangers people in a city also bakes the surrounding forests until they are ready to explode into wildfire, and evaporates the reservoirs that a region depends on for water and strains the power grid toward blackout. A modern heat wave is not an isolated bad week. It is a node in a web of interlocking, simultaneous, mutually reinforcing disasters, and that web, spanning the whole globe at once, is something the world has quite simply never seen before. So why is all of this happening? The hotter, the longer, the larger, the simultaneous, the human-caused. The underlying reason is the simplest fact in all of climate science. We have warmed the planet by burning fossil fuels, and a warmer planet holds more heat energy, and that extra energy has to go somewhere. It expresses itself as more frequent, more intense, more widespread extremes, and most directly and reliably of all, as heat. That is the engine under every one of the changes I've described. And it leads to an implication that has been quietly circulating among climate scientists, one that reframes this entire summer. For most of us, the summer we are living through right now will likely turn out to be one of the coolest summers of the rest of our lives. The heat waves that feel shocking and unprecedented today are not the ceiling we have finally hit. They are much closer to the new floor. Let me end, as I always try to, with honesty and balance, because a subject this heavy deserves clarity and not despair. None of this means that summer has become an apocalypse, or that any single scorching afternoon is proof of anything on its own. Natural variability is real, and this specific late July heat wave, as I said at the start, is not itself a record breaker. Parts of the country are actually pleasantly cool this week. Attribution science, for all its power, works in probabilities and models, and honest scientists are the first to say so. And crucially, the deadliest consequence of all this heat, the deaths, is also the most preventable through air conditioning, cooling centers, warning systems, and simple awareness. The point of this video is emphatically not to frighten you. It is to be accurate. And the accurate, evidence-based picture is clear, consistent, and no longer seriously in doubt. Heat waves as a category have fundamentally changed. They are hotter, more frequent, longer, larger, more simultaneous across the globe, and, for the first time in the history of our species, traceably, provably influenced by human activity. So when this heat wave finally passes, as it will, when the great Omega block breaks apart and the Dakotas cool and the alerts come down, it is worth remembering that the thing which truly made it different was never something you could have read off a thermometer. Every generation before ours sweated through heat waves and simply called it summer, and they were right to, because for them, that is all it was. Weather arriving from nowhere, belonging to no one. What makes the heat waves of our time different is not only that they are hotter, it is that we are the first people who have ever been able to look at the heat rising off the pavement and know, with the cold precision of the science, where it came from, and the first who therefore get to decide, with that knowledge in hand, what every summer that comes after this one is going to feel like. That is what is different. In the end, it isn't really the heat. It's us.